So we're here to talk about income inequality and money in politics. And the way I'm going to do this is pictures and then a story. We're going to go through a PowerPoint presentation to establish the basic facts about growth in income inequality since 1979, which is what my book is about. And then once and I think that's important because income inequality is a big subject, and I address a very particular aspect of it, which is the growth in income inequality since 1979 in the United States and what's been driving it. So we'll go through the PowerPoint, and I will try and go through these slides quickly. And then I'll read a portion of the book about Bryce Harlow, who is kind of the Benjamin Franklin of the corporate lobby in Washington, a founding father. And that'll give you some sense of how Washington's lobby culture was created. Let me just log on over here. So our story begins with the period called the Great Compression. That was the period from 1934 to 1979, when incomes grew more equal, or the income distribution remained relatively stable. It breaks down into two periods. 1934 to 1952, we saw incomes grow steadily more equal in the United States. And when we talk about incomes, we're really talking about the relationship between the middle class and the rich. One point that I want to make and that I may return to is this great divergence, this growth in the gap between the haves and the have-nots. The growth has occurred between the middle class and the rich. The relationship between the middle class and the poor hasn't changed all that much. It was lousy to be poor in 1979. It's lousy to be poor today. Maybe slightly less lousy, but it's still pretty lousy. The great divergence is the divergence between middle class incomes and the incomes of the rich. So from the early 30s to the early 50s, the relationship between middle class incomes and incomes of the rich was that they converged. Those incomes were becoming more equal. Thereafter, from 1952 to 1979, the relationship between middle class incomes and the incomes of the rich remained relatively stable. What do I mean by that? I mean that incomes for the middle class rose at about the same rate as incomes for the rich. This term, the Great Compression, was coined by the economic historians Claudia Golden of Harvard and Robert Margo of Boston University. When you look at this period, I can't resist quoting a libertarian writer named Brink Lindsay, who says, Republicans want to go home to the United States of the 1950s, while Democrats just want to work there. So this period of either growing income equality or income stability ended in 1979, and as many of you in the audience are in a position to know, everything bad in the world comes from the 1970s, including leisure suits, as we see there. The post-war economic boom ended in 1973 with the Arab oil embargo, inflation, and the energy crisis. Household median income stopped growing, even though there were more two-income households. And except for the tech boom of the late 1990s, pre-tax median income growth has been meager or non-existent ever since. I say pre-tax because there has been some distribution. Government benefits and taxation have certainly lessened the growth of income inequality, but they have not halted it. Income inequality, no matter how you calculate it, whether you calculate it before taxes or after taxes, income inequality has been growing since 1979. Now, the Great Divergence is not one trend. It's actually two trends. And this is a source of much confusion in a lot of the commentary on it. Two things happened at the same time. The first thing that happened is that the top 1% doubled its share of the nation's income from 10% to 21%. This is the trend that gave the Occupy movement its vocabulary. We are the 99%. The second trend is a more broad-based trend, and that is that people who lacked college or graduate degrees saw their incomes increase much more slowly than people who had college than people who had college or graduate degrees. And often people who lacked college or graduate degrees saw their incomes rise not at all. Now, when you talk about this, a lot of people will say, well, isn't that just capitalism? Isn't that how capitalism works? But remember those slides I just showed you. Income inequality is not intrinsic, or rather growth in income inequality is not intrinsic to capitalism. The United States was a capitalist country from 1934 to 1979, during which time income inequality shrank. Yes, some measure of income inequality is intrinsic to capitalism. Capitalism really wouldn't work if we all made the same amount of money, regardless of our effort and skill. The debate is not about whether everything should be equal. The debate is about whether it is healthy for income inequality to grow over 30-odd years. Okay, so let's talk about story one first. And that's a fairly simple story. So I'll try and it's probably a familiar one to you. The top 1% doubled its income share. The green patch you're looking at the top shows income share for the top 1%. And you'll see it thin after 1940 and stabilized in 1973, when the top 1% consumed about 8% of the nation's income. Starting in 79, the green patch starts to thicken, and by 2008, the top 1% is consuming 18% of the nation's income. Since then, it's grown to 21%. This shows it in black and white, a little more starkly. And again, you can really see here the difference between the Great Compression and the Great Divergence. Opposite trends. Same country, same capitalism, opposite trends. The 1% in the Great Recession. Recessions are bad for rich people, and so they really socked the wealthy. But as you can see here, recessions are bad for rich people. Recoveries are significantly better for rich people. The top 1% received 58% of all income gains during the recovery. That's from 2009 to 2014. The income gain for the 1% is 27. The top 1% in income distribution is 27%. The income gain for the bottom 99% is 4%. And here you see the impact of taxes and transfers. Oh, this doesn't come out so well. Well, basically, it reduces the top 1% share a little bit. But it goes from 19% as of a couple of years ago, to 15%. So yes, redistribution through taxes and government transfers has softened the growth of income inequality, but it has not halted it. Now, what's driving this? Simple story. What's driving it are out-of-control pay increases for top executives at non-financial corporations. And since the 1990s, that's been driven largely by stock option awards. And the other driver has been out-of-control growth in the finance industry, driven by Wall Street deregulation and investment banks' shift from partnerships to publicly owned corporations, enabling bankers to play with other people's money and let the government absorb the downside. Now we have a chart on the growth in CEO to worker compensation. There are about 1 million ways to calculate this, but they all have one thing in common, which is they show that the ratio of CEO pay to pay for the average worker has just gone off the charts since the late 1970s. The SEC has a forthcoming rule requiring companies to report this information in a standardized way. The companies have been putting the SEC off by saying, oh, it's so terribly complicated. It's not that complicated. But eventually we will have a uniform way of measuring that. Now the Butch Cassidy and the Sundance question, who are these guys? And they are mostly guys. Who are these people who are in the 1%? And actually the real question isn't the people who are in the 1%, it's the people who are in the 0.1%, because that's the group that is really driving growth in income inequality. So who are these people, these 0.1 percenters? About 60% of them are top executives and finance professionals. The proportions have shifted a little bit since '79. Financial professionals in the top 0.1% have nearly doubled their representation in this club. Non-financial executives remain a bigger share, but they've declined slightly in terms of their proportionate presence in this club. The other reason I like to show this chart is because there is a feeling abroad that income inequality is driven by celebrities and sports figures. And that's just clearly not true because there aren't enough of them to make much difference. If you look down here, down arts, media, sports, represent about 2.2% of this group. In 1979, they're up to 3%. So you can't really blame income inequality on Michael Jordan and Yo-Yo Ma. Now we move on to story 2, which is skill-based inequality. And this story is a little complicated. It's also occasions some disagreement, more disagreement among the experts than the 1% versus the 99% story. Basically, we're looking at a story of stagnation at the middle. During the Great Compression from 1950 to 1970, median household income grew by 63%. By contrast, from 1979 to 2014, median household income, which is currently at about $57,000 rather, has increased a mere 13%. So Great Compression, median income grew by 63%. Great Divergence, median income grew by only 13%. Big difference. Snapshot of today, and this very up-to-date data comes from a private group called Centier Research, which is run by a couple of former census people who like to come out with the numbers before the census does. The census doesn't actually have data on November 2015 yet. and they're pretty reliable, I've found. Median income as of November 2015 was 1.9% higher than at the recession's end. And you'll recall that the recession ended 7 years ago. And it's also 1.1% lower than it was in January 2000. And again, these numbers don't include the effects of taxes and transfer payments, but the trend, when you include those, is a steady but still quite modest increase in the median since 2000. So why is this happening? In my book, I go to some length to explain that most of the usual suspects, when we talk about inequality, are innocent when it comes to the growth in income inequality since 1979. Race and gender, when you think inequality, you think about race and gender, right? But it's inapplicable here, or mostly inapplicable, I should say, because the pay between blacks and whites, the gap between black pay and white pay is virtually the same as it was in 1979. Now, full stop when I say that. Let's go into a time machine and travel back to 1979. And we've gone back to 1979. I'm going to tell you that the gap in wages between African Americans and whites is exactly the same in the year 2016. You would tell me back in 1979 I was out of my mind. This is a shocking statistic that is worth discussion on its own. But it is not a statistic that suggests that the gap between blacks and whites has been driving the growth in income inequality. And it's a similar story of male-female pay. The gap between male pay and female pay has narrowed since 1979. Hasn't narrowed so much over the last decade, but since going back to 1979, it has narrowed. Well, if the pay gap is narrowing, then gender differences can't really be driving a growth in overall income inequality. Immigration. Logical that immigration would be affecting growth in income inequality. We liberalized our immigration laws in the mid-1960s. Income inequality started to grow, about a decade and a half later. Timing would seem to be persuasive, but scholars have looked at this and they have not been able to find any real connection between growing immigration and the growth in income inequality. And the reason is that the largest group that has affected, there's a very large group of high school dropouts who have been coming into the United States, and they are competing for jobs only with high school dropouts in the United States. So you do see some effect in the incomes of high school dropouts in the United States. But it's not a huge impact, A. And B, when we talk about this growth in income inequality, again, to repeat, it's a growth between middle-class incomes and the incomes of the rich. It's not really a story about incomes for the poor. So immigration is fairly off the topic as well. Another point I would add is that even as our politicians in Washington scream and yell about immigration, the immigration crisis that was caused by Mexicans, Donald Trump's favorite topic, ended several years ago. Mexicans are no longer pouring into the United States. The Mexican economy has improved to the point where movement between the United States and Mexico is pretty stable. I think, if anything, it might be slightly negative. There might be more people moving to Mexico now than moving from Mexico to the United States. Obviously, Central Americans are still coming in, but not in anything like the same numbers that Mexicans were. So the immigration debate is largely an argument about things that happened in the 1990s. Trade. Certainly, trade is inapplicable until the 21st century because we just weren't trading enough with low-wage countries for it to make much difference on incomes in the United States. That did change, however, in the 21st century when the United States started trading a lot with China and with Mexico. China is the most dramatic example. Is it a rich country or is it a poor country? The answer is yes. It's a country with an economy that's growing at an absolute breakneck pace, but it's also a country where wages are still third world wages, very, very low. And economic theory says that as a country starts to trade, as a low-income country starts to trade with higher income nations, wages will come up. That's true, but they don't come up that fast when you're talking about 1 billion people. So trade has become an issue in the 21st century, wasn't really much of one before that. So if we step back and say, well, what is driving the growth in broad-based income inequality, the gap between incomes for college graduates and people who didn't go to college? Two factors: the decline of labor unions and the government's retreat from pro-labor policies, which is actually traceable back to 1947, but it certainly accelerated in the 1980s. And the rise in demand for highly skilled workers. But it's really, for the last 15 or 20 years, it's really been mostly the first. The education's role in creating income inequality started to dwindle in the 1990s as we saw incomes for college graduates stagnate as well. Let's talk about the decline of labor. It's a simple, easy to grasp, depressing story. The Taft-Hartley Act passed in 1947, and that really was a sort of slow dripping poison on the labor movement. It made it much more difficult for labor unions to organize, and its effects took a while to be felt because the labor movement had a lot of momentum behind it in 1947. But as you see, union density peaked in 1954 at about 40% of the private sector workforce. Over time, it's dropped to below 7%, which is the same level as in 1933. One line that I wrote at this part of my book was, "It's as if the New Deal never happened." So the main driver is the Taft-Hartley law, but Ronald Reagan's politicization of the National Labor Relations Board also had a profound effect. Before Reagan, the NLRB was a relatively consensus-oriented board. More conservative members under Republicans, more liberal under Democrats, to be sure. But Reagan was really the first president who was openly hostile to labor. Ironic, because I think he's also the only United States president who was himself a former union president. And Reagan installed Donald Dotson, a management-side labor adversary, an advisor for Wheeling Pittsburgh Steel. He appointed Dotson to chair the National Labor Relations Board, and that led to a lot of decisions that were very flagrantly anti-labor. The Harvard economist Richard Freeman calculates that if the sole cause of growing income inequality were global trends, like the rise of globalization, global trade, then the average earnings for U.S. industrial workers in 2005 would have been $25 per hour rather than $16 per hour, which is what they actually were. Estimates of the effects of labor's decline on inequality growth range from about 1/3 to about 1/2. And here you see the income share for the top 10% is like the mirror image of the share of union membership. As one goes down, the other goes up. Not a huge surprise. Another thing that's going on is that wages are a declining share of total income. The share of the nation's total GDP going to wages has been declining since, depending on how you measure it, the early 1970s or the early 1980s, a period when labor was in decline. Looking at the education piece, that story is that a shortage of high school graduates was felt starting in the 1970s. For the entire 20th century until the 1970s, what you saw was that the skill level of American workers was rising pretty much in tandem with demand. And that was in large, the first part of the 20th century was because of the high school movement, where people really started to go to high school and stay there, which, that had been a relatively rare thing in the 19th century. And then in the middle of the 20th century, people started going to college with help from the GI Bill. But the high school graduation rate stopped growing in the 70s. And here you have Stephen Rose, an economist in Washington, who calculates the changing relationship of demand and supply for skilled workers. And you see they change places in the 1980s. The United States is a country that puts we'll move on to the next slide now. The United States is a country that places a high premium on skilled labor, much more so than other comparable nations, other industrial democracies. This is a comparison of OECD countries, and you'll see that the United States has a much larger wage return on skills than these other countries do. But, and it's an important but, moving on to the next slide, the role of education in creating income inequality petered out in the 1990s. You saw the so-called college premium, which was the difference between what you made if you were a college graduate and if you had never gone to college. That premium flattened out. It's still there, stopped growing. The college premium basically became a graduate school premium. And even the graduate school premium has been less than astonishing for the last 10 years or so. And as a couple of people have pointed out to me, any social policy addressing income inequality that assumes we're going to send a majority of Americans to graduate school is probably unrealistic. So the question is, did all of this just happen? No, it didn't just happen. Government influenced the outcome, and business influenced government. Let's move on to talking about lobbying. The top spenders in 2015 are not going to surprise you. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce is at the top, National Association of Realtors, and so on. If you go all the way down to number 20 on this list, you still won't find a single labor union. So there is an extreme imbalance in the in the amount of spending by individual associations affiliated with business and individual associations affiliated with labor. Labor does a little better when you're dividing it up by sector. Here, labor does make it into 12th place, spending $45 million. That's as opposed to $517 million spent by miscellaneous businesses, $507 million spent by health, and so on. These are all figures from last year. So I don't think this is a wildly unfamiliar story to you, but it's good to look at the numbers and appreciate what those disparities are. They translate into disparities in incomes for the middle class and for the rich. And now we get to Bryce Harlow, the star of the show. He is remembered by almost no one. To the extent that he's remembered at all, he's remembered as a kind of a good guy advisor to Richard Nixon, especially during Watergate, and that is true. He was a man with an excellent temperament and integrity. He was just what Richard Nixon needed when things were going down the drain. Although he wasn't really in a position to help much, since the reason things were going down the drain was that Nixon was found guilty of many crimes. But Bryce Harlow has another identity, which is he's the founding father of corporate lobbying, and I'm going to get into that when I read a passage from my book. But before I do, I just want to share with you two quotes from one of the reasons I really like Bryce Harlow is because he makes you a little bit nostalgic. He just said it. You know, he didn't beat around the bush. You didn't have to waste a lot of time wondering what Harlow's views were about either inequality or about business's power in Washington. The first quote, something he said looking back on corporate lobbying, which again is a business that he largely helped create in Washington. He said, "When business really tries, when it is fully unified and raring to go, it never loses a big battle in Washington." Bracingly honest thing for a corporate lobbyist to say, I think. The second quote I'll let you read for yourself. It's long, but it speaks, I think, very eloquently to Harlow's disdain for the whole notion of political equality. And he did see the rise of the corporate lobby as a counterforce to the rise of political equality. It was conscious, it was articulated by Harlow, and his language is just very vivid and very ruthlessly honest. "The days of democracy are numbered when the belly of the system takes charge of its head, when the vagrant on the street corner, resentfully eyeing the passing limousines of the privileged, the talented, and the influential, sets about using his equal vote as he would use a pistol in a bank." That is what Bryce Harlow thought about the trend towards equality that we saw from the 30s through the 60s.